Hey everybody, thank you for joining us on the FareCompare weekly video podcast, episode number 29. My name is Rick Sini. I'm the co-founder and CEO of FareCompare, and we got a couple different things during our podcast today. We're going to chat about some interesting new news with Alaska and Virgin America announcing a merger. JetBlue also in the mix for that bidding, so we'll talk about what that means for flyers. Also, a question I get quite a bit is, especially from travel hackers, is which is better, one-way versus round-trip tickets. We'll talk a little bit about that too. And then we'll also take a couple questions from customers that I'm seeing for the first time here. And joining me today to talk about these interesting new topics is our editor from the site at FareCompare.com, Ann McDermott. Hey, Ann, how are you today?
Hey, Rick, we've got some good questions, and perfect for saving money. I think these guys will be very glad they asked these questions of you.
Good. No, I love those kind of questions. So I think, the first topic up, especially for a lot of folks on the West Coast, is what's going to happen between Alaska and Virgin America with this new merger that's been announced over the weekend. Hit the news. There's been rumors of it for several weeks, and then there was a sort of a bidding war between Alaska and JetBlue. Apparently, Alaska wins the bidding war. And I know I've flown Virgin America a few times. In fact, I got to interview Richard Branson one time on one of those flights. So a completely different experience than you would normally have on U.S. domestic airlines, on purpose, clearly. And so, one of the questions that I have is the first thing that I looked at the deal, it was like, okay, so are they going to ditch the Virgin brand here in the U.S.? Richard Branson had noted in a blog post that he was, quote unquote, sad that this occurred, intimating that he would have tried to stop it had he had the power to. I'm not positive that's the case. I know that there's a lot of issues with foreign investment. I'm positive there's a bunch of private equity that has shares in that would probably override, since it's a pretty nice premium on Virgin America. So, without Richard Branson, do we really expect an Alaska Virgin or a Virgin Alaska? I don't think so. Likely, where are you going to book your ticket? At virginamerica.com or alaskaair.com? So if you answer those questions, I think that tells you where it's probably going, which means that brand's probably going away here in the U.S.
Yeah, what's funny, and I'm just trying to look it up because I cannot remember which it was, but Virgin America was just named Best Airline.
Yeah, in the new airline quality report, it's it ranked #1, and clearly they have a loyal following. Then the question is, can Alaska turn those loyal followers? Remember, they have to merge the loyalty program. That can be very disconcerting for some people. We've seen that with these mega mergers the last 6 or 7 years. The merging of those loyalty programs can be fairly contentious.
As you pointed out before, though, that they usually do a fairly good job of that because they don't want to disturb any.
Yeah. Who wants to alienate the incoming customers to the acquirer? It's kind of a crazy thing. The question is, can Alaska provide that cachet that Virgin America flyers? And by the way, the interesting thing about Virgin America, was a really weird experience because it was a great experience and the prices were good. It's sort of like, usually, and Virgin Atlantic sort of had a different brand because the experience is really good and the prices are pretty expensive, which was a little bit opposite for Virgin Atlantic, partly because where they were and them trying to grow, especially out of the West Coast, and also more recently, out of a few gates here in Dallas where we live. We've seen that battle going on. So it'll be interesting to see how this shakes out. Now, I would note for consumers that mergers take forever. So in fact, Alaska and Virgin America won't be able to talk to each other except for some strategic matters. They won't be able to talk about flight schedules, aircraft purchases, air prices, or anything like that. So it'll be status quo for the foreseeable future. This will have to go through a lengthy process, including the Department of Justice looking into it. And if you recall, their first pass at the American U.S. Airways merger, they nixed that in the first pass, and it had to go through a second pass in order to get that approved.
Okay, I've got a question. As you have pointed out again and again and again, mergers mean fewer airlines, less competition. Less competition equals higher airfare prices. Are we in store for, paying more for our tickets?
Yeah, their overlap is pretty minimal, about half a dozen routes. For the people that are on those routes, and by the way, there's a significant number on those routes, the price will go up. There's no doubt with the loss of that competition. That's just the way it works. But that may not happen for, well, first of all, the merger won't occur for a year or so or more, and then later on it'll take a little while for that to kick in. But on those routes, I would expect, they would be adding capacity on the West Coast. In certain cases, a lot of that competition comes from Southwest Airlines, which would be great if they battle it out with Southwest. There's really no low-fare airline anymore because all of them, literally you have 4 airlines controlling 80%, and now, Alaska with a bigger chunk of the pie of the rest of the 20%. They're all going to have more expensive prices on the routes that I have least competition on. So expect those things, for example, out of Portland, Seattle. That's not going to change things much.
I got one more question.
Sure.
Potential merger candidates would seem to an ideal pairing would seem to be like Spirit and Frontier. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm looking at what's there. Spirit and Frontier now both ultra low cost models. Certainly that sounds interesting from a merger perspective potentially. I was just looking at the airline quality report. Ann, when I first got the airline quality report, I think it was about maybe 8 or 9 years ago, there was 25 airlines on the report. Now there's 13. And a couple of these Envoy, ExpressJet, SkyWest that are on there are basically just regional contractors for the bigger airlines. So the interesting thing is that this list is getting pretty small. That's not going to be good for consumers at such time when, hey, look, if we have growth in the country at 3%, which I hope we have soon, I'm not really excited about oil prices potentially going back up to $100 a barrel, but I'm realistic saying that likely is to occur over the next, let's say half decade or so. And when those two things actually happen, the question is, will flying only be for the rich if we only have a handful of airlines in the U.S.?
Well, here's a way that flying might be for those of us who are not rich.
That was a quick segue. Let's just seg right into one-way tickets versus round trip.
Should we buy? Some people say, should I? Or I think a big assumption of most people is that, okay, a round-trip ticket, say, costs $200. Therefore, the one-way ticket, if you only have to go one way, is going to be half of $100. So it'll be $50.
Right. To answer this question, I'm just going to get just minorly technical. When you actually have an itinerary, let's say it's a round-trip itinerary, they do price each way different with one-way fares along with round-trip fares. A round-trip fare you would have in both directions. You would use half the round-trip price to do it, and they do price it. Now, there is a big difference between buying 2 one-way tickets. First of all, you have to split your ticket purchase, and sometimes inventory does change on the same airline. From the vagaries of the way inventory works, sometimes the same airline will have cheaper inventory for one-ways than round trips, or vice versa, by the way. The other part of this equation is if you're a bit of a hacker, you can buy a one-way ticket on one airline and then a one-way ticket on another airline that normally wouldn't price together, for example. You got to be a little bit more of a hacker there when doing those kind of queries. It takes a little more time to do it. We're actually piecing together some software that actually does this with some of the caching that we do on our system, so you can do that. It's a little more complicated transaction. In some cases, some people even like to hack these even when you're flying, for example, on a long-haul trip to Europe or Asia, where you do a one-way ticket to the coast, then get a round-trip ticket coast to where your destination is in Europe, and then use the other half of the other ticket coming back. And that can be cheaper sometimes as well. Now, this is not for the faint of heart. and probably not for families of 4 or 5, for example, that are traveling.
Yeah.
But for a couple people, it can actually save you some money if you're willing to sort of dig around and do that searching.
Well, one thing that you hear again and again is that you should not, or sometimes people say it's a great tip to save money. Say there's
Right.
you buy yourself a round trip ticket to, say, New York, but it stops in Chicago, and you really want to go to Chicago, and the New York trip, that round trip ticket is a lot cheaper than just going to Chicago. So what some people do is they get off at Chicago, voila, having saved money. But that's a big no-no, is it not?
Well, yeah, the airlines definitely think that's what's called hidden city. We saw, I think even United, I think even maybe Orbitz joined into that suit against a site that was basically showing those potential price differences. And by the way, that's not necessarily the airline's intent, but if you do that, a couple things can occur. First of all, you can't do it on the first half of your trip because they're going to cancel the rest of your trip as soon as you don't make one of the legs of your trip. So that's
Right.
number one. Number two, if you have an award account, some sort of status on those airlines, that also can be revoked if they catch you doing stuff like this. And as an agent, or at least a historical agent in my case, that's definitely a no-no for travel agents to try to help people with hidden cities. There's other techniques that also are sort of no-nos from airlines. But in general, because consumers are buying their own tickets, it's very hard for airlines to sort of know when you're doing these kind of those things are a bit of a no-no. So look, I mean, if you're an airfare hacker, you know what all these techniques are. There's lots of sites that describe those techniques.
Mm-hmm.
It's tougher to be for example, a mileage runner than it used to be because the airlines have all gone to a dollar-based system for acquiring miles. Now you can still do it to achieve elite status. You can also that's an easier thing since it's still mileage-based, and you have to have your quote-unquote derriere and a seat of miles flown. But actually redeeming for tickets, there's been a variety of what I would call, or what a lot of people call, devaluations in the virtual currency of airline miles, and some changes in almost every one of the programs from the major airlines.
Yeah.
So again, hacking is a fun hobby. We do it around here all the time. I know that it's a fun story for me to tell how I had dinner in Beijing with my wife one time because she wanted to have platinum status on American Airlines, and we did that on one trip. Those were the good old days of hacking.
Well, if you want to read more about this, because it's kind of a complicated subject, obviously, come to our site, FareCompare.com, and you'll see plenty. And now, the best part of this is the questions from customers. Okay, we've got one from David. He is in Minneapolis. And he says, a friend and I would like to fly to Sweden, staying at least 2 weeks or more. And he says, as Rick says, flexibility is key.
Yeah,
so
it's true.
David from Minneapolis can fly out of Minneapolis, but also Rochester, Minnesota, Milwaukee, Chicago, even La Crosse, Wisconsin would work for us. So he says, what would be the cheapest and best time to fly this year? And apparently he also obviously wants to know, from where, what airports. So.
Sure, yeah, no, David, you are in luck because once a month I do a call-in show with Wisconsin Public Radio, and I know every little city from La Crosse to Eau Claire, all around Green Bay, and all the other cities that I mentioned there as well as Rochester as well. So in general, when you're flying to Europe, couple quick tips. First of all, you want to fly if you can on midweek. There's what's called weekend and midweek pricing. Weekend tends to be, depending on the airline, between $20, I've seen it as high as $40 more each way if you want to leave. That's Saturday, Sunday, sometimes on a Friday. So your best bet is sort of middle of the week trip. They also have Saturday night stay rules. You want to stay 2 weeks, David. Saturday night stay rules basically means you can't leave on a Sunday, come back on a Saturday. You didn't really stay a Saturday night. But that won't be any issue in your case. Now, getting to the Nordic countries has become a lot cheaper. As we've noticed, as we noted in previous content on the site and video podcasts, it's one of the cheaper places to fly into over the last 18 months or so. That includes Denmark. Icelandair has some great deals. There's also in Norway, Sweden, Finland, for example. We've seen Norwegian air shuttle flying into some of those cities as well, and so you have some choices there if you want it to be really cheap. Now, as far as the time to fly, if you can, the flexibility there is to try to stay away from summer, or if you want to go in the summertime, be right at the edges, like before June, about the mid part of the second week in June, around June 10th, and then the last week in August, around August 25th. June 10th, the prices jump up. August 25th, the prices go down pretty dramatically. So if you can do that, that's going to save you some money. Do it on midweek. If you want, you can also take one of these carriers. It's almost always more, well, in fact, 99.9% of the time, it's cheaper to fly out of both either Minneapolis or Chicago than out of one of these regional cities. Essentially, you'll be connecting in either Chicago, Denver, or Minneapolis, depending on which airline you happen to be flying on. And that regional city usually carries anywhere from a $75 to $150 each way premium for the convenience of not having to drive to that bigger airport, especially if you live closer to those cities.
Yeah, I'm noticing flights to Stockholm on, as you mentioned, Norwegian Air, WoW Air, and of course, there's a billions others, but those are particularly cheap. But they only fly out of a limited number of cities, and they don't fly out of Chicago, at least not right now.
No, it's mostly in the Northeast right now, but we're going to see that change, I think, over time. They'll probably slide in Chicago. It may not help David this year. So you're basically looking at the main airlines and their partners. So that would be, for example, United, Air Canada, Lufthansa in that combination, Delta and Air France, KLM, American with British Airways, for example, are going to be your best bets in there. Now, you could hack an airfare, like we talked about earlier, to the East Coast and then take a Norwegian Air Shuttle or WoW, which can be very inexpensive. We've seen those trips, the difference in those trips where you sort of hack that airfare and go to the East Coast, a savings per person of anywhere from $200 to $400 or $500.
Because I noticed there's some flights to Stockholm out of a lot of them out of Boston that can be very cheap, and say he's got friends there, that might be doable. But if you did do something like that, in effect, you're taking two airlines. You've got to be a little cautious about doing that, particularly so you don't miss your flight to Europe.
Yeah, certainly. You need to leave ample time between those and connections. And in the cases when I do this, and I do this a lot when I go to the West Coast and fly to Asia, because I'm not a huge fan of those lengthy trips. I'd rather spend the night in California on the way out to those places. So in some cases, you want to leave the lengthy connection. In my case, I like to sort of spend the night and prepare for a long day of flying. So that's what I tend to do. But again, you have to leave those windows open. Remember, the airline that you're flying, transoceanic with isn't going to help you if your other ticket has an issue, right? So if you can't make it to your connection or you get back and miss a connection, that's one of the niceties of buying a through ticket, is that they will accommodate you either on their own airline and another flight or on another airline if they have issues.
Okay, Deandra from St. Louis says, my family is going to, I'm going to butcher this, Merida, Mexico, M-E-R-I-D-A, Merida, Mexico.
Merida, I guess in Texas. I'm not sure how much to roll that particular R, but that's close enough, sure.
They are going from June 1 to June 17th for a language abroad experience. Sounds wonderful. And the flights from St. Louis are about $1,400 plus per person. Now, I looked it up, and this is kind of near Cancun, by the way. It looks like between 50 and 100 miles from Cancun. They are asking if you have any advice on how to get there for cheap. They've rented a house. They are now looking for flights at this point, and any airports they should consider leaving from. Again, Deandra is in St. Louis. So
well, a couple things. And I'm not as very familiar with that particular city, but if it's close to Cancun, let's just assume that they're flying into Cancun, right?
Okay.
and taking a car. So I $1,400 a person from St. Louis to Cancun. That's highway robbery
Yeah.
for a coach ticket. So we'll have to figure. I'll have to go look and see. I wouldn't have expected. I would have expected historically that price to be, potentially in the $600 to $700 range at the maximum. So I'm gonna have to figure out. I mean, this is a 16 or 17 night trip. I don't think that's the problem. I don't know if they actually are looking at going into Merida, and I'm butchering that probably myself, directly, and maybe that's what's adding to the dollar amount. I'll have to check that out. But
Yeah.
as far as going to Cancun, it's a bit of the off season to actually go in June, so it's a little bit cheaper. Clearly, this is one of those ones where at a $1,400 per person on a flight, and literally, we're talking about a flight that's probably, in the just slightly above 3 hours. That's a ridiculously high price. So we definitely could hack our way to a much cheaper price in that particular case. So maybe it's a regional airport and they're flying into it and they're having a huge premium. Maybe in order to get to that regional airport, you can't actually connect in Cancun. You actually have to collect in Mexico City. Maybe that's why they're charging more. I have to actually look that up, and we'll send Deandra a note personally here once I look that up exactly. But she should be able to make that trip in there in that $500 to $600 range at a cap, and depending on what day, if she has some flexibility on those particular dates. It might even be cheaper than that. I've seen prices, for example, out of Chicago, out of places like Houston, into Cancun. We have now Southwest flying in there, so if we can get her down to Houston, she might be able to switch airlines. So I don't know. She didn't say if it was a large family or not. Typically don't like to hack stuff for people that have 3 or more in their party, but in general,
it says my family, so
yeah. So what I think we should see if we can get her out of a more local airport. I know out of St. Louis, there's not a really, in a 2-hour radius of St. Louis, there's not a huge major airport, but 3 hours out, there's some options there.
Well, and if anybody else has any question, obviously Rick would love to help you. If you could please send it to customer.service@faircompare.com and see what happens.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The thing I would note too, as we close up the podcast today, is that just posted an article on Virgin America and the merger into Alaska Airlines on LinkedIn. You can catch that there. You can catch us all the time at FareCompare. We have great blogs. They have the adventurous content coming out soon on the website, but we have the native app. Please download the native app. Another set of really cool destinations. Just simply type in FareCompare, F-A-R-E, compare.com/app on both Google Play and iOS, the actual app store for the Apple products. So check that out, and we'll catch you on episode number 30 next week.
Ooh, thanks, Rick.
Thanks.